Chapter 5, Digital Media, Internet, and Political Attitudes in Europe. We're looking at 15 different European countries to see how the Internet affects interest in politics and internal political efficacy. Now, we're also doing something different. We're not just looking at a two-country case study. We're looking at 15 countries in one analysis, so we call this a cross-country analysis. But we're also looking at it over time. In our previous chapter, our methods, we looked at a snapshot in time, running up to an election or right after an election. But here, we're looking for a 7-year span of time to see over that time period, over all these countries, does the internet really matter? So this chapter is really trying to make an effort to expand our ability to generalize on how digital media and the internet affect political interest and political engagement worldwide. So we look at our first model, and what do we see? That increasing internet use in our European countries does in fact lead to interest in politics. But there are some exceptions, but we'll get to those in a second. First, we always want to look at our other control variables to see if other factors are similar as well across cases across the world. And what do we find here is that these same control variables are significant in these European countries that were significant in the US and in Spain before. This is extremely important. This is saying that politics and democracies work similar. Now, which ones do we see? We see gender once again is there. We said, sadly enough, this is probably because of a legacy of patrimonial societies and politics. But we see that in Europe as well as in the US. We see education matters. The more you know about how the world works, the more you are interested in politics, perhaps. Age also matters as well, just like it does in the US. We find that older people tend to be more interested in politics in Europe. Exposure to TV or radio news and reading the newspaper. This is interesting because it means that if you consume news, then you are more likely to have an increase in interest in politics. All right, so that's traditional media. What's important about that is the implications are that the internet is working the same way as traditional media. We like to think that the internet is revolutionary. This suggests otherwise. This suggests that it works in a very similar fashion. But what about some exceptions we see in this one? As far as newspaper reading, there are 3 countries that do not apply to this interpretation: Greece, Portugal, and Italy. In these 3 countries, reading the newspaper does not increase interest in politics. Now, why might that be? Where have we heard something about these countries before? Media beyond the Western world? Our 3 models, the polarized pluralist models, were based on these countries. And what is the characteristic for newspaper circulation in polarized pluralist countries? Low newspaper circulation. This is quantitative analysis that backs up the qualitative analysis of our previous book. This is showing in numbers that politics don't necessarily work the same as far as media and politics in polarized pluralist countries versus non-polarized pluralist countries in Europe. It's a pretty significant finding. Now let's look at our second model. And right away we do find evidence that the internet, by an individual using the internet more, it is likely to lead to their increase in internal political efficacy. And we have the same control variables show up significant again. However, for newspaper reading, we see that Portugal drops off, and we get the addition of Belgium, France, and Austria. France was also a polarized pluralist country. Belgium and Austria were not. But what does this imply? This implies perhaps that Belgium and Austria, over time, have moved more towards the polarized pluralist countries. That perhaps newspaper circulation in those 2 countries in particular has decreased faster than other European countries in the study. And thereby, because of it, reading newspaper doesn't affect an individual's internal political efficacy in that country. Now, this is one of the amazing things about cross-country time series analysis. You can see how different countries drop in and out of your significance in your analysis by looking at this. So now we know out of the 15 countries, 5 of them, newspaper reading doesn't matter. But all 15 of them, internet use does matter. So we're increasing our generalizations, but we're also sharpening our understanding that some variables matter more in other places. And obviously, newspapers matter less in Belgium, France, Austria, Greece, and Italy. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to keep going. Because one good thing people like to do whenever they're doing this type of research, they like to take one of their cases and do an analysis just on that case, but in the exact same fashion. And that's exactly what we're going to look at now. So the authors pulled one of their 15 countries, Spain, out of the analysis and did the analysis just on that one country to see what they found. And they found something pretty big and pretty important. They found that for interest in politics in Spain, the internet does not matter. Why might this be the case? Well, if you remember to our previous chapter from the Democracy in Media book on Spain, perhaps it's about internet domestication rates. Also, we see exposure to TV and radio news has a negative effect on interest in politics. Why would that be the case? Why would consuming news via those mediums make you less interested in politics? Spain is a polarized pluralist country. High political parallelism. Perhaps people know that if they consume those mediums, that they are just going to receive partisan bias information. And thereby reading them makes them less interested in politics. It makes you more apolitical. There could be another potential explanation too, something that this model does not take into account. But what might be another reason that people read newspapers, listen to radio, or watch TV in Spain? Soccer, football, sports are huge in Spain. It could very well be that people who do consume those medium, they do so for sports reasons, not for political reasons. But then as a byproduct of consuming the sports, they are exposed to political information, but they dislike it, so it makes them less interested in politics. Hence, that could be a possible explanation for the negative effect on interest in politics in Spain. But let's go see what happens whenever we look at internal political efficacy. Now we see our two independent variables are measured a little bit differently because they're trying to really get at Spain and see what's going on. So they use years of internet use and an index of internet ability. This should sound familiar. This should sound like technical skills, which are one of the digital divides. So we see as these two independent variables increase, they do lead to an increase in internal political efficacy in individuals in Spain. All right, so perhaps the internet does matter in Spain. But we see exposure to TV, radio, news, or reading a newspaper still has a negative effect. But there is another variable that's significant that I do want to talk about, and it's this index of political activity. This, once again, might be an issue of multicollinearity, an independent variable that is measuring something that is too similar to internal political efficacy. And if one of your independent variables and your dependent variable are too similar, that is called multicollinearity. There's too much correlation between the two. They should be separate variables. And if there is that issue of multicollinearity, it could weigh down the results of your analysis. And it could actually even render them not significant. Which, once again, moving forward and forward and forward, we're going to start asking more and more questions about statistics. And just to see, can we accept all statistics at face value? Now let's think about some real-world implications of our study. So we found, for the most part, in at least 10 of our 15 European countries, that increasing internet use alone leads to a higher interest in politics and leads to more internal political efficacy within individuals. Is this important? Well, once again, thinking about democracies and the quality of democracy and representation, yes, this is extremely important. It not only means that we can generalize more about how democracies work across the globe, but it means these variables can help us improve the quality of our democracies around the world. And it also gives us which factors we need to focus on most. That's a big deal. It's a really big deal. But I would like to draw attention to one potential issue, and that's how the authors measure internal political efficacy. Internal political efficacy, in many ways, is how well you feel you can understand politics, but also how much of a difference you can make in politics. Right? External political efficacy is about if politicians listen to the public to enact change. Internal political efficacy, though, is your own ability to become part of politics. Now, the way these authors measure these variables, it's a little bit questionable, maybe. In some respects, it's almost like they're measuring it as a self-reporting version of political knowledge. How well I think I understand politics? Like, it's pretty similar. So you could arguably debate this is not the best measure for internal political efficacy, which is something we'll talk about in a lot of variables moving forward. And it's something you should ask when looking at statistics. But then why would they choose this measure if it is maybe questionable? Probably because they didn't have any other options. Running data, you need to create data first. How do you create data? Surveys, lots and lots of surveys. And here they did surveys over 7 years, over 15 countries, and multiple different languages. In order for the regression analysis to work properly, when you ask someone about internal political efficacy in Spain, in French, when you ask someone in Germany about internal political efficacy in German, those two things have to match up. The translations have to match up. Otherwise, the numbers, they cannot differentiate that. If internal political efficacy means two different things in two different places, the numbers cannot work that out, and the regression will be biased. So perhaps this wording is the closest they could get in translations so they could do a cross-country analysis over time. It's one of the drawbacks about trying to do this type of analysis, this type of large-scale analysis. Language barriers, for sure. But it doesn't mean that we should not continue to try. It creates a benchmark for us to improve on over time. And I think this is a great example of one of those benchmarks for us to build on, for our understanding for how democracy and politics and media all work around the globe.